It was 20 degrees below zero, and her two cats had been outside for too long. The woman stepped onto her porch, expecting to find her missing pets, but what she found instead left her breathless. A massive mother bobcat sat surrounded by 5 tiny kittens gathered on the deck. Remarkably, her house cats were sitting calmly just inches away from the wild feline. Predator and prey sat together in an impossible peace. The woman stood frozen, unable to process what she was seeing. No one moved, but the real shock came moments later. A movement in the shadows hinted that another predator had been watching and stalking all along. What happened next turned her frozen porch into something impossible. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The silence of an Alaskan winter is not simply the absence of noise. It is a heavy physical weight. It presses against the windows, seeps through the cracks in the floorboards, and settles deep in the bones of anyone brave enough, or stubborn enough, to call the far north home. For Pam Ose, a lifelong resident of this rugged corner of the country, the silence was usually a companion. It was the sound of peace, of isolation chosen and cherished. But on this particular Tuesday, in the dead heart of January, the silence felt different. It felt like a threat. The thermometer by the kitchen window read 20 degrees below zero. The sun was a pale, shy coin tossing weak light over the spruce trees, offering no real warmth. Pam tightened the belt of her flannel robe and wrapped her hands around a mug of coffee that was already losing its steam. She stared out at the expanse of white that stretched from her porch railing to the tree line, searching for a flash of movement, a paw print, a familiar silhouette. "Gizmo?" she called out, her voice cracking slightly. "Suitcase?" Usually, the rattle of the kibble jar was enough to summon her two cats from the deepest naps or the furthest corners of the yard. Gizmo, a sturdy tabby with a sense of entitlement, and Suitcase, a black and white rescue named for his tendency to trip her whenever she packed for a trip, were not just pets. Since her husband had passed 3 years prior, the cats had become the ticking clock of her life. They were her routine. They were her family. But today, the bowl was full and the house was empty. They had been let out for their morning patrol an hour ago. Usually, in temperatures like this, they would sprint to the edge of the deck, sniff the biting air, and demand to be let back in within 10 minutes. An hour was too long. Much too long. Pam felt that familiar, cold knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach, the specific dread of a pet owner in the wild. Alaska was beautiful, but it was not kind. It was a landscape governed by the food chain. Eagles patrolled the skies, silent and lethal. Wolves ghosted through the timber. And then there were the coyotes, scrappy, hungry, and opportunistic. "Please," she whispered to the empty room, "just be under the porch." She couldn't wait any longer. Pam set her mug down and moved to the mudroom, layering up with the practiced efficiency of a local. Thermal leggings, heavy denim, wool socks, boots lined with sheepskin, a parka that went down to her knees, and a knit cap pulled low. She grabbed a heavy flashlight, though the midday light was sufficient, mostly for the feeling of having a weapon in her hand. She opened the back door. The air hit her like a physical slap, instantly freezing the moisture in her nose. The snow on the porch was packed down, but fresh powder had fallen in the night, creating a pristine blanket that betrayed every movement. "Gizmo, Suitcase!" Her voice was swallowed instantly by the vastness of the woods. She stepped out, the wood of the deck creaking in protest under her boots. She scanned the perimeter. Nothing but snow-laden branches and the glittering dust of ice in the air. Then she heard it. It was a sound that made her blood run cold. A low, guttural growl followed by a sharp, high-pitched scuffle. It wasn't the play-fighting of house cats. It was the sound of the wild asserting itself. Panic, hot and frantic, surged through her chest. Coyotes, she thought. They've cornered them. She moved faster, disregarding the slick patches of ice near the railing. The sound was coming from the far side of the porch, near the large storage bins she used for gardening supplies. It was a blind spot, tucked away from the wind. "Get away!" Pam shouted, waving the flashlight like a club, hoping to scare off whatever predator had found her babies. "Get out of here!" She rounded the corner, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She expected blood. She expected the worst heartbreak a pet owner could endure. She braced herself to see the broken body of Gizmo or the terrified eyes of Suitcase. She stopped dead in her tracks. There was Gizmo. He was sitting inside an overturned plastic bin near the siding, looking entirely unbothered. He blinked at her, his green eyes calm, his tail wrapped neatly around his paws. He looked for all the world like a king holding court. "Gizmo!" Pam breathed, the relief making her knees weak. "You bad boy! You scared me to death!" But the scuffling noise hadn't come from Gizmo. And where was Suitcase? "Suitcase?" she called, her voice trembling again. As if on cue, the black and white cat came bounding up the porch stairs from the yard, shaking snow from his paws. He trotted over to Gizmo and headbutted him, a greeting of pure casualness. Pam let out a long, shuddering breath, a cloud of white vapor escaping her lips. They were fine. They were safe. The panic began to recede, replaced by a mild irritation. "You two are going to be the death of me," she scolded, stepping forward to scoop Suitcase up. But then she froze again. The cats were here. They were silent. So, what was making that noise? The growl came again. It was deeper this time, vibrating through the wood of the deck. It wasn't coming from the woods. It was coming from right there, on the porch, just beyond the storage bin where Gizmo was sitting. Pam gripped the railing. She had assumed the noise was her cats being attacked. But her cats were right there, watching the corner with an expression that wasn't fear. It was curiosity. Slowly, carefully, Pam took one step, then another, craning her neck to see around the bulk of the storage bin. She saw the tufted ears first, black, pointed, and unmistakable. Then, the ruff of fur around the face, patterned like a wild tabby but infinitely more savage and beautiful. Then, the eyes, gold, piercing, and locking directly onto hers. Pam turned pale. Her breath hitched in her throat. It was a bobcat, and not just a bobcat. It was a massive female, her coat thick and plush against the winter chill, her paws the size of saucers. She was lying on the doormat, pressed against the warmth of the house wall, less than 5 feet from where Gizmo was sitting. For a lifelong Alaskan, seeing a bobcat wasn't impossible. But seeing one this close, one that didn't immediately bolt, was unheard of. They were ghosts of the forest, solitary and elusive. To see one on a porch was rare. To see one sitting calmly next to a house cat was insanity. "Oh my God," Pam whispered. The bobcat, who Pam's mind immediately christened Mama Bob, didn't hiss. She didn't flatten her ears. She simply watched Pam with a weary, heavy-lidded gaze. She looked exhausted. The winter had been harsh, the snowpack deep, making hunting difficult for even the most skilled predators. Pam stood frozen, unsure of what to do. If she moved too fast, would the wild cat attack Gizmo? Bobcat claws could eviscerate a house cat in seconds. But Gizmo didn't seem to care. He sat there, blinking slowly, as if he and this apex predator had come to a gentleman's agreement. Then, the snow around Mama Bob moved. Pam gasped. At first, she thought it was the wind, but then a tiny head popped up from the curve of the mother's belly. Then another. And another. One by one, the camouflage broke. 2, no, 3, 4, 5 tiny kittens. They were impossibly small, balls of spotted fluff with oversized paws and blue turning gold eyes. They were tumbling over each other, mewling softly, the source of the strange noises she had heard. They were climbing over their mother, batting at her ears, oblivious to the freezing temperature or the terrifying human standing a few yards away. 2 of the kittens, bolder than the rest, toddled away from the safety of their mother's fur. They moved with the clumsy, drunken gait of babies, their tails sticking straight up like antennas. They weren't heading toward the woods. They were heading toward Suitcase. Pam held her breath. Suitcase? No, she whispered, terrified her cat would swipe at the wild kittens and trigger the mother's rage. But Suitcase, the cat who tripped her on the stairs and stole chicken off her plate, simply lowered his head. He sniffed the tiny bobcat kitten. The kitten sniffed back, batting a paw at Suitcase's nose. Suitcase didn't hiss. He just sat down, watching the babies with a bewildered, tolerant expression. It was a scene from a storybook, something that defied every rule of nature Pam knew. Predator and prey, domestic and wild, sharing the same 10 square feet of wooden decking. Mama Bob watched the interaction, her muscles tense, ready to spring, but she remained still. She had made a calculation. The cold was the greater enemy today. The porch offered shelter from the wind, and perhaps the presence of the other cat signaled a zone of safety. She was a mother first, a predator second. She had brought her babies here because she had nowhere else to go. Pam slowly lowered her hand, the flashlight forgotten. She felt tears prick her eyes, not from the cold, but from the sheer, overwhelming privilege of the moment. She was witnessing a truce, a ceasefire called by Mother Nature herself. But the surprises weren't over. Just as Pam was beginning to process the Bobcat family, a rustling sound came from the stairs, the same stairs Suitcase had just run up. Pam turned, her nerves already frayed. What now? A bear? A wolf? A snout poked over the top step. It was long, narrow, and dusted with snow. A pair of amber eyes peered over the rim of the deck. It was a coyote. Pam's instinct was to shout, to clap her hands, to drive it away. Coyotes were the enemies of cats. They were the scavengers, the tricksters. But she stopped herself. This wasn't a large, snarling adult. It was a young one, barely more than a puppy, likely separated from its pack or kicked out to find its own territory. He looked rangy and thin, his coat patchy. He shivered visibly, lifting one paw off the cold wood and then the other. He didn't look at Pam. He looked at the group. He saw the bobcat. He saw the kittens. He saw the house cats. In the wild, a bobcat would kill a coyote pup. A coyote would kill a cat. A human would chase them all. It was a triangle of animosity that had existed for thousands of years. But on this porch, on this freezing Tuesday, the rules had been suspended. The young coyote hesitated, his body low to the ground in a posture of submission. He whined, a high, lonely sound. He wasn't hunting. He was asking. Mama Bob lifted her head. She locked eyes with the coyote. A low rumble started in her throat, a warning, but she didn't rise. She pulled her kittens closer with a sweep of her heavy paw, but she didn't attack. She seemed to assess the coyote's threat level and found it wanting. He was just another freezing soul. Slowly, tentatively, the coyote crept onto the porch. He didn't move toward the cats. He moved toward the far corner, near the dryer vent where warm air sometimes puffed out from the house. He curled up into a tight ball, nose tucked under his tail, making himself as small as possible. Pam stood there, her hands covering her mouth. Her porch had become an Alaskan version of the peaceable kingdom. It was beyond bizarre. It was miraculous. I need the camera, she whispered to herself, the thought breaking through her trance. She backed away slowly, moving with agonizing slowness so as not to startle the assembly. She slipped back inside the house, her heart racing. She grabbed her DSLR from the kitchen table, her hands shaking so hard she almost dropped the lens cap. She returned to the window first, terrified that if she opened the door again, the spell would break. She wiped the condensation from the glass and looked out. They were all still there. Gizmo had actually moved closer to the Bobcat kittens, watching them wrestle with the detached air of a babysitter who isn't being paid enough. Suitcase was grooming his paw, sitting just a few feet from the sleeping coyote. Mama Bob's eyes were closed, her head resting on her paws, snatching a moment of precious sleep while her babies were safe. Pam clicked the shutter. Once. Twice. She opened the door again, moving like a ghost. She needed to be closer. She needed proof that this wasn't a hallucination brought on by cabin fever. She stepped out. The coyote opened one eye, looked at her, and closed it again. Mama Bob's ear twitched, but she didn't move. "You guys," Pam whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're all just trying to stay warm, aren't you?" She sat down on the bench near the door, keeping a respectful distance. She watched for an hour. She watched as the Bobcat kittens grew bold enough to sniff the coyote's tail. The coyote didn't snap. He just tucked his tail tighter. She watched as Gizmo brought a dead leaf to the kittens, dropping it like a toy. It was a lesson in survival that Pam would never forget. Humans often project their own wars and biases onto nature. We see the violence, the red in tooth and claw. And it is there. Nature is brutal. But nature is also pragmatic. Fighting takes energy. Killing takes energy. In the deep winter, energy is the most expensive currency of all. Violence is a luxury of the warm. Here, in the bitter cold, survival was a cooperative effort, even if that cooperation was just a mutual agreement not to kill each other for an afternoon. As the afternoon wore on and the sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long blue shadows across the snow, the truce began to dissolve. Not with violence, but with necessity. The coyote was the first to leave. He stood up, stretched his stiff limbs, and looked at Pam one last time. A look of acknowledgement. He trotted down the stairs and vanished into the brush. Then, Mama Bob stirred. She stood up, her massive frame stretching. She let out a soft chuffing sound. Immediately, the 5 kittens stopped their play and scrambled to her side. She looked at Gizmo and Suitcase, then turned her gaze to Pam. There was a moment of connection there. Mother to widow, wild to tame. A silent thank you for the sanctuary. She turned and leaped gracefully off the side of the porch, sinking into the deep snow. The kittens followed, hopping like little rabbits in her wake, disappearing into the white silence of the woods. Pam was left alone on the porch with Gizmo and Suitcase. The silence returned, but it didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt sacred. "Come on, boys," Pam said, her voice steady and warm. "Let's get you some dinner." She ushered her cats inside, the warmth of the kitchen enveloping them. She went to her computer and uploaded the photos. On the screen, the image was undeniable. The golden eyes of the mother bobcat, the playful blur of the kittens, the sleeping coyote, and her own 2 cats, all sharing the same wooden stage. She typed out a caption, her fingers flying across the keys. "Our cats, coyotes, and bobcats basically get along just fine here. They aren't always out to attack and kill each other." She knew people would doubt it. She knew the internet would call it photoshopped. Experts would say it was impossible behavior. But looking at the photo, at the softness in Mama Bob's eyes and the trust in the coyote's posture, Pam knew the truth. She made herself a fresh cup of coffee and sat by the window, watching the darkness swallow the forest. She thought about the mother bobcat out there in the dark, fighting to keep those 5 kittens alive. She thought about the lonely coyote searching for a pack. She realized she wasn't just a lonely widow in a big house anymore. She was a neighbor. She was a witness. Pam smiled. The image of the kittens playing with Gizmo burned into her mind forever. The world was harsh, yes. The winter was long. But there was mercy in the wild if you knew where to look. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very quiet, it would come right up to your porch and sit for a while. "Good luck, Mama Bob," she whispered against the glass. "Good luck." Suitcase jumped into her lap, purring loudly. Pam stroked his fur, feeling the warmth of life against her palms. Outside, the wind began to howl, but inside, everything was warm and bright and full of love.